married to a cold-hearted billionaire. What happened on their wedding night made her cry. Elena's hands trembled as she signed the marriage contract, her new husband's icy gaze never leaving the documents. Alexander Billionaire, Enigma, and now her husband, had made it clear this was a business arrangement, nothing more. But when the bedroom door clicked shut on their wedding night, the man who'd barely spoken 2 words to her all day finally broke his silence. What he confessed in the darkness shattered every assumption she'd made, and the tears that fell weren't the ones she expected to cry. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and the billionaire's secret would change everything. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comment section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Industries boardroom like 1,000 desperate fingers seeking entry. Elena Martinez sat rigidly in the leather chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Across the mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles, her father avoided her gaze, his weathered face a mask of shame and desperation. "Please, Mr. Sterling." Her father's voice cracked, and Elena felt her heart crack with it. "Just 6 more months. I promise I can turn the company around. 25 years I've built Martinez Construction. 25 years of blood, sweat, and poor financial decisions." A cold voice cut through the air like a blade of ice. Elena's eyes snapped to the man seated at the head of the table. Alexander Sterling. Even his name sounded like winter, sharp, unforgiving, beautiful in its cruelty. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair that fell perfectly into place and eyes the color of a frozen lake. His charcoal suit probably cost more than her father's mortgage payment. "Mr. Martinez, I'm a businessman, not a charity." Alexander's fingers drummed once against the table, a sound that echoed like a judge's gavel. "Sterling Industries has given your company 3 extensions. Each time, you've promised improvement. Each time, you've delivered disappointment." Elena watched her father shrink in his seat, this man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had worked double shifts to send her to college, who had danced with her at her graduation. Now he looked small, defeated, broken. Something fierce and protective ignited in Elena's chest. What about a merger? The words left her mouth before her brain could stop them. Every head in the room turned toward her. Her father's eyes widened in alarm. But it was Alexander Sterling's gaze that pinned her to her seat, sharp, assessing, with the barest hint of curiosity, like a scientist examining an unexpected variable in an experiment. "I beg your pardon." His voice was soft, dangerous. Elena lifted her chin, meeting those ice-cold eyes even as her heart hammered against her ribs. A merger. A business arrangement. Martinez Construction has expertise in sustainable building practices that Sterling Industries lacks. We have connections with unions and local governments that could benefit your expansion into South America markets. We are worth more as partners than as a liquidated asset on your balance sheet. Alexander leaned back in his chair, and Elena couldn't tell if the slight curve of his lips was amusement or contempt. An interesting proposal. But mergers require trust, Ms. Martinez. And your father's track record suggests he's not a reliable partner. Then partner with me instead. The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the rain outside, could hear the hiss of her father's sharp intake of breath. "Elena, no," her father whispered. "You don't know what you're saying." But she did know. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd spent 3 years earning her MBA, working her way up from project coordinator to junior partner in her father's company. She'd brought in their 2 biggest clients. She'd streamlined their operations, cutting costs by 18% while maintaining quality. She'd seen the writing on the wall 6 months ago when the first Sterling Industries notice arrived, and she'd been preparing for this moment ever since. "I'm the future of Martinez Construction," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Give me control of the company. Let me prove its value. If I fail, you can liquidate. But if I succeed, Sterling Industries gains a valuable subsidiary and expertise you currently lack." Alexander Sterling studied her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under glass. His eyes traveled from her face to her hands, still clutched in her lap, then back to her eyes. Elena refused to look away, even as heat crept up her neck. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting. But I'm afraid expertise and good intentions aren't enough collateral for a $7 million debt. $7 million. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, through assets they could liquidate, through loans they could secure. But she already knew the answer. There was nothing left. Her father had already mortgaged their house, already cashed out his retirement, already sold her mother's jewelry, the jewelry that was supposed to be Elena someday. However, Alexander continued, and something in his tone made Elena's stomach drop, I might be willing to consider an alternative arrangement. He stood, and Elena was struck by how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the room despite his lean frame. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, and looked out at the rain-soaked city below. I need a wife. Elena blinked. Surely she'd misheard. Excuse me. A wife, Alexander repeated, turning to face her. His expression was completely neutral, as if he'd just commented on the weather. My grandfather established a trust that comprises 40% of Sterling Industries voting shares. According to the terms of that trust, I must be married by my 33rd birthday, which is in 6 weeks, or control of those shares passes to my cousin, Richard. He said the name Richard the way one might say plague-carrying rat. Richard is an imbecile who would run this company into the ground within a year, putting 8,000 people out of work. I won't allow that to happen. However, I've been unsuccessful in finding a suitable candidate who understands that this would be purely a business arrangement. Elena's father stood abruptly. Absolutely not. Elena, we are leaving. I'll file for bankruptcy before I let you. Sit down, Mr. Martinez. Alexander's voice cracked like a whip, and to Elena's shock, her father Saturday. Your daughter is an adult capable of making her own decisions. Let's hear what she has to say. All eyes turned to Elena once more. Her mind spun like a tornado, trying to process what was being proposed. Marriage. To this cold, calculating stranger. In exchange for her father's company, for the livelihoods of the 200 people who work there, for her family's legacy. What exactly would this arrangement entail? She heard herself ask. A marriage in name only, Alexander said, returning to his seat. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table to her. You would live in my penthouse, attend social functions as my wife, and maintain the appearance of a conventional marriage. In exchange, your father's debt will be forgiven, and you'll be installed as CEO of Martinez Construction, which will operate as a wholly owned subsidiary of Sterling Industries. Elena opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside was a contract, dense with legal language. But certain phrases jumped out at her. Separate bedrooms, no physical intimacy required, term of 2 years, $5 million trust fund upon completion of term. 2 years, she whispered. My grandfather's trust stipulates that I must remain married for a minimum of 2 years to maintain control of the shares. After that period, we can quietly divorce. You'll walk away with $5 million, full ownership of Martinez Construction, debt-free, and your father can retire with dignity. It was insane. Completely, utterly insane. Elena looked at her father, who had tears streaming down his face. She thought of her mother, who had died 5 years ago, whose last words to Elena had been, "Take care of your father." She thought of all the workers at Martinez Construction, people like Maria, who had worked in their office for 15 years and had 3 kids in college, or Jose, who was 2 years from retirement, or Yuki, who was saving up to bring her parents to America from Japan. I need 24 hours to think about it, Elena said. Alexander nodded. Fair enough. But Ms. Martinez. He leaned forward, and those ice-cold eyes bored into hers. Don't mistake my offer for kindness. This is a business transaction, nothing more. I have no interest in romance, in companionship, or in anything resembling a real marriage. If you accept, you'll be entering a contract, not a relationship. I want to make sure you understand that. I understand perfectly, Mr. Sterling. Elena gathered the folder and stood, proud that her legs didn't shake. You want a wife who won't make the mistake of falling in love with you. Lucky for you, I have absolutely no intention of doing so. For the first time since she'd entered that boardroom, Alexander Sterling smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve of his lips, but it transformed his face from coldly handsome to devastatingly beautiful. Then we may have a deal, Ms. Martinez. Elena didn't sleep that night. She sat at her small kitchen table in the apartment she'd rented after graduate school, reading through the contract page by page, making notes, looking for loopholes or dangers. Her father had called 7 times. She'd ignored each call. She needed to think without his guilt or his protests clouding her judgment. The contract was actually fair, surprisingly so. Separate living quarters within the penthouse. A generous monthly allowance for clothing and expenses befitting her role. Freedom to maintain her own career and interests. The only requirements were attendance at specified social functions, residence at his primary home, and discretion about the true nature of their arrangement. There was a morality clause. No romantic relationships with others during the term of the marriage. That stung a little, though Elena's dating life had been non-existent for the past 2 years anyway, buried under work and worry about her father's company. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elena picked up her phone and sent a text to the number Alexander had provided. I accept your offer. When do we start? The response came within seconds, as if he'd been waiting. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Sterling Tower. We have a wedding to plan. Elena's hand trembled as she set down the phone. What had she just agreed to? Marriage to a stranger. 2 years of living a lie. But when she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face, saw the faces of all those employees depending on Martina's construction survival. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with it. What Elena couldn't know, was that across the city, in a penthouse suite that overlooked the glittering skyline, Alexander Sterling stood at his own window, watching the same sunrise paint the same sky. In his hand was his phone, displaying Elena's acceptance message. And on his face was an expression that none of his business associates would have recognized, a mixture of relief, anticipation, and something that might have been loneliness, quickly masked and locked away. He'd told her the truth. He needed a wife for the shares, for the company, for his legacy. What he hadn't told her was that he'd investigated 27 potential candidates before settling on Elena Martinez. Smart, principled, desperate enough to agree but strong enough not to break. Perfect for his purposes. What he definitely hadn't told her, hadn't even fully admitted to himself, was that when she'd lifted her chin and met his eyes across that boardroom table, something had shifted in his chest. Something he'd locked away years ago after. No. Alexander shook his head, banishing the thought. This was business. It had to be business. He'd learned long ago what happened when you let emotion into the equation. He bore the scars to prove it, both visible and hidden. Elena Martinez would be his wife in name only, and he would make absolutely certain that neither of them made the mistake of wanting anything more. Chapter 2. The Cold Groom. The next morning came too quickly. Elena stood outside Sterling Tower, craning her neck to see the top of the gleaming skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. 78 stories of steel and glass, a monument to power and success. And somewhere in there was the man who would become her husband in less than 2 weeks. Her phone buzzed. A message from Alexander, 78th floor. Ask for Victoria. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with a fountain in the center that probably cost more than her college education. Security guards in crisp uniforms nodded as she approached, as if they'd been expecting her. Which, she realized, they probably had. The elevator ride to the 78th floor felt eternal. Elena watched the numbers climb, each one taking her further from the life she'd known and closer to. What? A gilded cage? A business arrangement? A terrible mistake? The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a reception area that looked like it belonged in a modern art museum. And standing there, as if she'd been waiting for hours, was a woman who could only be Victoria. She was probably in her 50s, with silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon and wearing a designer suit that screamed efficiency and class. But her eyes were kind as they took in Elena's off-the-rack blazer and sensible heels. Ms. Martinez, she said warmly, extending her hand. I'm Victoria Chen, Mr. Sterling's executive assistant. We spoke briefly on the phone. Welcome. Thank you, Elena managed, shaking her hand. Victoria's grip was firm, confident. Mr. Sterling is finishing a conference call with Tokyo, but he asked me to get you started on the preliminaries. Coffee. Tea. Coffee, please. Black. Victoria smiled approvingly as she led Elena through a hallway lined with abstract paintings that probably each cost 6 figures. No sugar, no cream. A woman after my own heart. You'll find that Mr. Sterling appreciates efficiency and directness. No games, no pretense. They entered a conference room with a view that took Elena's breath away. The entire city sprawled below them, looking like a toy model from this height. Before we discuss wedding details, Victoria said, setting down a coffee cup that bore the Sterling Industries logo, I need you to sign some additional documents. Standard NDAs, background check authorizations, medical records release forms. All routine for employees at your level. Employees. The word stung, but Elena supposed that's what she was, really. A very well-compensated employee playing the role of wife. She was halfway through the stack of paperwork when the door opened. Alexander Sterling entered the conference room like winter personified. He wore another immaculate suit, navy this time, and his dark hair was slightly damp, as if he'd recently showered. The faint scent of cedar and something crisp, like mountain air, followed him. Ms. Martinez, he greeted her, but didn't extend his hand. I trust Victoria is taking good care of you. Very good care, Elena said, refusing to be intimidated by his cold formality. We are just going through the paperwork. Excellent. He sat at the head of the table, and Victoria immediately handed him a tablet. I've taken the liberty of arranging the basics. The wedding will be in 13 days, Saturday the 23rd, at the Sterling Estate in Greenwich. Small ceremony, approximately 50 guests, primarily business associates and necessary family members. Elena's pen paused on the NDA she'd been signing. My family. Your father will of course be invited. Other immediate family members as you see fit. However, his eyes locked on hers. They cannot know the true nature of our arrangement. As far as anyone is concerned, this is a whirlwind romance. We met a month ago, fell quickly, decided not to wait. A whirlwind romance. With this man who looked at her like she was a quarterly report. Elena almost laughed at the absurdity. How exactly did we meet in this fiction? She asked. For the first time, Alexander's expression flickered with something that might have been approval. At a charity gala for the Metropolitan Museum. You were there with your father. I was there as a board member. We were introduced by mutual acquaintance, discovered shared interests in architecture and sustainable development. I was impressed by your passion for your work. You were charmed by my... He paused, and was that a hint of self-deprecation in his voice? Generosity to the arts. Charmed, Elena repeated flatly. Right. Victoria hid a smile behind her tablet. Can you sell it? Alexander asked, and his voice had gone sharp. Because if you can't convince my grandfather, my board, and society's gossip columns that this is real, the whole arrangement falls apart. I need to know now if you're capable of playing your part. Heat flooded Elena's cheeks, but whether from anger or embarrassment, she couldn't tell. She stood, walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Alexander. He watched her approach with those unreadable ice blue eyes. I spent 3 years getting my MBA while working full-time and taking care of my dying mother, Elena said quietly. I've negotiated contracts with union leaders who wanted to destroy my father's company. I've smiled and shaken hands with city officials who would have taken bribes to cut corners on building codes, then reported them to oversight committees. I've been underestimated my entire life because I'm young and female and because I have the audacity to work in construction. So yes, Mr. Sterling, I can play my part. The question is, can you? Silence filled the conference room. Victoria had gone very still, her eyes wide. Then Alexander stood, and Elena had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He was so close she could see flecks of grey in those blue eyes, could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw despite the early hour. I suppose we'll find out, he said softly. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and took her left hand, his fingers cool against her skin. Elena's breath caught as he examined her hand, turning it over, studying her fingers. Ring size? He asked Victoria, without looking away from Elena. 6.5, Victoria responded immediately. I already contacted Harry Winston. Of course she had. Elena had the distinct impression that Victoria Chen could orchestrate an entire wedding in her sleep. The ring will be ready Wednesday, Alexander continued, still holding Elena's hand. His thumb brushed across her ring finger, the touch clinical, impersonal, yet somehow Elena's skin tingled where he touched. We'll need engagement photos for the announcement. Victoria has scheduled a photographer for tomorrow afternoon. You'll need a new wardrobe. Victoria will take you to meet with a stylist after this meeting. He released her hand, and Elena had to fight the urge to curl her fingers into a fist, to preserve the unexpected warmth where his skin had touched hers. Any questions? He asked. Elena had 1,000 questions. Why had he really chosen her? What had made him so cold, so controlled? What was he like when he wasn't playing the role of billionaire CEO? But she swallowed all of those and asked the practical one. When do I move into the penthouse? After the wedding. Until then, you'll maintain your current residence. It would look suspicious otherwise. He returned to his seat, already pulling up something on his tablet. Victoria will handle the rest of the logistics. I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Just like that, she was dismissed. As if she was just another item on his calendar, squeezed between the Tokyo call and whatever meeting came next. Elena gathered her things, following Victoria toward the door. But something made her pause, made her turn back. Mr. Sterling. He looked up, one eyebrow raised in question. For the record, I don't expect this to be easy for either of us, Elena said. But I'm not afraid of you, or intimidated by your money, or impressed by your coldness. I'm here because 200 people are counting on me. So you can be as distant and businesslike as you want. It doesn't change the fact that for 2 years, we are going to be partners. And partners should at least respect each other. She didn't wait for his response. She walked out, her head high, her heart pounding. Behind her, Alexander stared at the closed door for a long moment. Victoria, who had known him for 8 years, who had seen him build an empire and destroy competitors without flinching, watched as something complex crossed his face. She's perfect, Victoria said quietly. She's temporary, Alexander corrected, his voice hard. Don't forget that, Victoria. And make sure I don't either. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Elena's head spinning. The stylist turned out to be a tiny Italian woman named Francesca who took one look at Elena's wardrobe and declared it a tragedy that must be immediately rectified. Elena was poked, prodded, measured, and draped in fabrics that cost more per yard than her monthly rent. You have good bones, Francesca announced, as if this was a tremendous compliment. Strong shoulders, long neck. We can work with this. Mr. Sterling has excellent taste. He chose well. Elena bit her tongue to keep from saying that Alexander had chosen her for her company's sustainable building expertise, not her bone structure. The engagement photos were an exercise in awkwardness. The photographer, an intense man named Marcus who spoke in metaphors about capturing essence and revealing truth, positioned Elena and Alexander in a sun-drenched corner of Sterling Tower's executive lounge. Closer, Marcus commanded. No, closer. You're engaged, not business associates. Mr. Sterling, your hand on her waist. Ms. Martinez, look at him like you're in love. Elena tried. She really did. But staring into Alexander's face, seeing the rigid control in every line of his expression, made her feel like she was trying to love a marble statue. This isn't working, Marcus sighed. There's no chemistry, no warmth. Mr. Sterling, tell her something personal. Something that will make her smile. I don't do personal, Alexander said flatly. Then we are going to be here all day, Marcus shot back, and Elena was impressed that he dared to argue with the notoriously cold CEO. Alexander's jaw clenched. His hand, which had been resting stiffly on Elena's waist, tightened slightly. Then, so quietly that only she could hear, he said, I'm terrified my cousin is going to set fire to my grandfather's life's work, and you are the only thing standing between me and that disaster. So if you could please just look at me like you don't regret this decision for 5 seconds, I would be grateful. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her since this arrangement began. Elena blinked up at him, seeing for just a moment past the ice to something almost human underneath. And when she smiled, it was genuine, not because she was in love, but because she recognized a fellow person drowning in circumstances and desperately treading water. Marcus's camera clicked rapidly. Yes. That's it. Whatever you just did, keep doing it. The ring arrived on Wednesday, as promised. Victoria presented it to Elena in Alexander's office, a stunning emerald-cut diamond set in platinum, with 2 smaller diamonds flanking it. It was easily 4 carats, maybe 5, and probably cost more than her car. It was my grandmother's, Alexander said, not looking up from his computer. Modified to fit your size, but the center stone is original. My grandfather gave it to her on their wedding day 60 years ago. Elena froze, the ring box in her hand. Your grandmother's ring? But this is just... I thought this was just business. It is business, Alexander said curtly. But my grandfather will notice what ring you're wearing. He'll expect family jewelry. This accomplishes that while maintaining the appropriate illusion. He still hadn't looked at her. Elena felt something twist in her chest. Anger, maybe, or disappointment. She wasn't sure which. If I'm wearing your grandmother's ring, won't your grandfather expect us to act like a real couple? She asked. My grandfather expects me to continue the family legacy. This ring serves that purpose. Finally, Alexander looked up, and his eyes were as cold as ever. Put it on. We need to get used to seeing it there. Elena slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which was somehow worse. A ring that belonged to a woman who had been truly loved, now adorning the hand of a woman in a business transaction. Beautiful, Victoria murmured. Then, more hesitantly, Mr. Sterling, perhaps you should tell Ms. Martinez about the wedding night arrangements. Alexander's expression turned glacial. That's not necessary. I believe it is, Victoria insisted, and Elena was once again impressed by the older woman's courage. These things should be discussed beforehand, not discovered on the evening in question. What arrangements? Elena asked, looking between them. Alexander's jaw worked, as if he was grinding his teeth. Finally, he said, the Sterling estate includes the main house and several guest cottages. Family tradition dictates that the bride and groom spend their wedding night in the Rose Cottage. It's expected. But we'll have separate bedrooms in the penthouse, Elena said slowly, understanding dawning. So this is just for show. The cottage has 1 bedroom, Victoria said gently. But there's a very comfortable couch in the sitting room. I've already arranged for extra pillows and blankets to be placed there. Elena's cheeks burned. Of course. The wedding night. She hadn't even thought about that aspect of this arrangement. The idea of spending a night in the same room as Alexander Sterling, this cold stranger who was about to become her husband, made her stomach flip uncomfortably. I see, she managed. That's fine. I can take the couch. You'll take the bed, Alexander said sharply. I'll take the couch. That's not necessary. Ms. Martinez. His voice cut through her protest like a knife through silk. You'll take the bed. This discussion is over. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed without question. Elena bristled at his tone, but something in his expression stopped her from arguing further. This wasn't about gallantry or consideration. This was about control, maintaining his rigid control over every aspect of this arrangement. Fine, she said tightly. I'll take the bed. The day before the wedding, Elena's father came to her apartment. He looked older than he had just 2 weeks ago, new lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Major, he said, pulling her into a hug that nearly broke her heart. You don't have to do this. We'll find another way. But they both knew there was no other way. The deadline had passed. Without Alexander's intervention, Martina's construction would already be in receivership. I want to do this, Papa, Elena lied, holding him tight. Alexander he's a good man, and I'm ready to get married. Her father pulled back, studying her face with eyes that had known her for 26 years. You're lying to me. I'm not. Elena, you're wearing a ring that costs more than our house, and you've been home exactly twice in 2 weeks, and every time I've seen you, you look like you're preparing for battle, not a wedding. So don't insult me by pretending this is some fairy tale romance. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, that she'd be strong, but her father's understanding was too much. I'm doing what needs to be done, she whispered. For you. For our family. For everyone at the company. Please don't make it harder by questioning it. Her father cupped her face in his weathered hands. Your mother would be so proud of you. And so angry at me for letting you sacrifice yourself like this. It's not a sacrifice, Elena insisted, even though they both knew it was. It's 2 years, Papa. I can handle 2 years of anything. What she didn't say, what she barely admitted to herself, was that she was terrified. Not of Alexander. Despite his coldness, she didn't fear him. But she was terrified of losing herself in this arrangement, of becoming just another beautiful thing in Alexander Sterling's collection, of forgetting who Elena Martinez really was under the designer clothes and the family jewels and the lies. Promise me something, her father said. Promise me you'll remember that you deserve more than a business arrangement. You deserve love, Major. Real love. Elena kissed his cheek.
I promise, Papa.
But for now, let me do this my way. That night, alone in her apartment for the last time as Elena Martinez, unwed and unburdened, she stood at her window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a penthouse that would become her prison for the next 2 years, Alexander Sterling was probably working late, preparing for their wedding with the same cold efficiency he brought to every business deal. Did he ever doubt this plan? Did he ever wish, even for a moment, that this could be something real? Elena shook her head, banishing the thought. It didn't matter what he wished. This was business. She needed to remember that. But as she climbed into bed, her hand unconsciously moved to touch her grandmother's ring on her finger, and she couldn't help but wonder about the woman who had worn it first. Had she been happy? Had her marriage been built on love or duty? Had she ever regretted her choice? Elena had a terrible feeling she'd spend the next 2 years finding out the answers to questions she'd never wanted to ask. The morning of Elena's wedding day dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of the guest room at Sterling Estate where she'd spent the night. She woke to find Victoria already there, a garment bag draped over one arm and a look of determined efficiency on her face. Good morning, Mrs. Sterling, Victoria said with a small smile. How does it feel? I'm not Mrs. Sterling yet, Elena said, her voice rough with sleep and anxiety. Technically true. But in approximately 8 hours, you will be. Your hair and makeup team will arrive in 30 minutes. I've brought breakfast, nothing that will stain or bloat. And your dress. Victoria unzipped the garment bag, revealing the wedding gown that had been custom-made in an impossibly short time frame. It was stunning, a creation of silk and lace that managed to be both elegant and modern, with a fitted bodice and a flowing skirt that would photograph beautifully. Elena's throat tightened. This was really happening. It's beautiful, she whispered. Mr. Sterling selected the designer personally, Victoria said. He has excellent taste. Of course he did. Alexander Sterling had excellent taste in everything. Suits, art, wine, architecture. And now, apparently, brides. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The hairstylist swept Elena's dark hair into an elegant updo, leaving a few soft tendrils to frame her face. The makeup artist created a look that was natural but polished, emphasizing Elena's eyes and adding color to her lips. Through it all, Elena felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold, some other woman being prepared for her wedding day. Her father arrived as she was stepping into the dress. His eyes filled with tears when he saw her. Major, he breathed. You look just like your mother on our wedding day. That broke something in Elena. She crossed to him, careful not to wrinkle the dress, and let him hold her while she tried not to cry and ruin her makeup. I love you, Papa, she whispered. Everything I'm doing, it's because I love you. I know, he said roughly. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice, Elena lied for what felt like the 100th time. I'm choosing this. Before her father could respond, there was a knock at the door. Victoria entered, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Sterling asked me to give you this. She held out a small velvet box. He said it belonged to his grandmother, that she would have wanted you to wear it. Elena opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was a necklace, a delicate platinum chain with a single teardrop pearl pendant. It was simple, elegant, and undoubtedly expensive. There's a note, Victoria said quietly. Elena unfolded the small card. My grandmother always said that pearls represent tears of joy. She wore this on her wedding day. I thought you should have it. Despite the circumstances, I hope today brings you more joy than tears. It was the kindest thing Alexander had said or done since this arrangement began. Elena's hand shook as she fastened the necklace around her throat, the pearl settling perfectly at the hollow of her collarbone. Thank you, she told Victoria. Tell him I said thank you. Victoria nodded, but there was something knowing in her eyes, something that made Elena uncomfortable. Did she suspect the truth? Did she know this was all a carefully orchestrated business arrangement? The wedding ceremony was to take place in the estate's garden, under a canopy of trees that had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. As Elena waited with her father in the main house, she could see guests arriving, elegant men and women in designer clothes, all of them looking curious about the mysterious woman who had captured the notoriously cold Alexander Sterling's heart. If only they knew the truth. Ready? Her father asked, offering his arm. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Together, they walked out into the autumn sunshine, down a path lined with white roses, toward the altar where Alexander waited. And despite everything, despite the circumstances, despite the contract, despite her determination to remain emotionally detached, Elena's breath caught when she saw him. He was devastating in his tuxedo, all sharp angles and perfect tailoring. But it was his expression that stopped her heart. For once, the ice in his eyes had melted slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like awe. He watched her approach with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world, like this moment mattered. It's an act, Elena reminded herself. He's just playing his part. But when she reached the altar and her father placed her hand in Alexander's, the way his fingers closed around hers felt real. Solid. Anchoring. The officiant began to speak, but Elena barely heard the words. She was too focused on Alexander's face, on the way his thumb unconsciously traced small circles on the back of her hand, on the muscle that ticked in his jaw. I, Alexander James Sterling, take you, Elena Rosa Martinez. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something Elena couldn't identify. To be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. The traditional vows. Words that meant everything and nothing, depending on the circumstances. When it was Elena's turn, she looked into Alexander's eyes and spoke clearly. I, Elena Rosa Martinez, take you, Alexander James Sterling, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse. 2 years later, ice melts into love. Elena stood in the bedroom of the penthouse, their bedroom now, not separate rooms as the contract had stipulated, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and rose. Behind her, she felt rather than heard Alexander wake, felt the shift of the sheets as he sat up. You're awake early, his voice rumbled, warm with sleep. So different from the cold, clipped tone he'd used that first day in the boardroom. Couldn't sleep, Elena admitted. Today is the day, Alexander finished. He crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. 2 years. The contract is complete. The contract. That piece of paper that had brought them together, that had promised her $5 million and ownership of Martinez Construction, that had stipulated 2 years of marriage in name only, that had laid out in precise legal language exactly how their arrangement would work. The contract that neither of them had looked at in over a year. I've been thinking, Elena said, her heart hammering, about what happens next. She felt Alexander tense behind her. In the window's reflection, she could see his expression, carefully neutral, guarded. The ice threatening to return. Elena. Let me finish, she interrupted gently. When I signed that contract 2 years ago, I thought I knew exactly what I was getting into. A business arrangement. 2 years of playing a role. Then freedom and enough money to never worry again. Alexander's arms loosened around her waist, and Elena felt panic rise in her chest. She turned in his embrace, forcing him to look at her. What I didn't expect, she continued, her voice shaking slightly, was to fall in love with you. The words hung between them like a confession. Alexander's face remained impassive, but Elena saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. That first wedding night, Elena continued, needing to say this, needing him to understand. When you insisted on taking the couch, do you remember what you said when I asked why? Alexander's eyes closed briefly. I said that just because this was a business arrangement didn't mean I had to be cruel about it. That was the first crack, Elena whispered. The first moment I realized that maybe you weren't as cold as you wanted everyone to believe. Let me take you back 6 months into the marriage. Elena had been living in the penthouse for half a year, and they'd fallen into a routine. Separate bedrooms, polite distance, public affection for appearances, private detachment for survival. Until the night Elena had gotten the call about her father's heart attack. She'd been in her room, reading, when her phone rang. The hospital. Emergency. Come quickly. Elena had barely processed the words before she was moving, throwing on clothes, grabbing her keys. She'd made it as far as the elevator when Alexander appeared, already dressed, car keys in hand. I'll drive you, he'd said simply. You don't have to. Elena, I'm driving you. The hospital waiting room had been sterile and cold, fluorescent lights making everything look harsh and unreal. Elena had sat with her hands clenched in her lap, replaying every conversation with her father, every moment wasted on work instead of time together. He's going to be okay, Alexander had said beside her. You don't know that. No, he'd admitted. But your father is stubborn. He's not done fighting yet. They'd sat in silence for a while. Then, so quietly Elena almost missed it, Alexander said, my mother died of a heart attack when I was 16. She was yelling at my father about something. He was always working, never home, and she just collapsed. Right in front of me. Elena had turned to stare at him. In 6 months of marriage, Alexander had never volunteered personal information, never shared anything about his past. I tried CPR, he'd continued, his voice flat, emotionless. But I didn't know what I was doing. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. She died in the hospital 3 hours later. Alexander. Elena had breathed, reaching for his hand without thinking. He'd flinched but hadn't pulled away. My father never recovered. He threw himself into work even more, built Sterling Industries into an empire. But he was just empty. A shell. He died 5 years later, officially a stroke, but really, I think he just gave up. That's when my grandfather took over raising me. Taught me that emotion was weakness. That love made you vulnerable. That business was safer than feelings. Elena had squeezed his hand, understanding flooding through her. The ice, the distance, the control, it wasn't cruelty. It was protection. I'm not going to die on you, she'd said firmly. And neither is my father. We are both too stubborn. Alexander had almost smiled at that, and he'd held her hand for the next 4 hours, until the doctor came out and told them that her father would make a full recovery. On the drive home, as dawn broke over the city, Elena had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. She'd woken up in her bed, shoes removed, blanket tucked around her, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. But she'd known. Alexander had carried her. That was the second crack in the ice. Fast forward to 9 months into the marriage. Martina's construction had been thriving under Elena's leadership. She'd secured 3 major contracts, including a sustainable housing development that would become a model for future projects. The company was not only solvent but profitable. To celebrate, Elena had organized a party for all the employees, the people whose jobs she'd saved by marrying Alexander. She'd invited Alexander, expecting him to make a brief appearance and leave. Instead, he'd stayed for 3 hours. Elena had watched in amazement as Alexander, cold, controlled Alexander Sterling, had talked with the workers, had asked about their families, had actually listened to their stories. He'd played basketball with Jose's grandson in the parking lot. He'd complimented Maria's daughter's quinceanera dress. He'd discussed Japanese architecture with Yuki for 20 minutes. You're good at this, Elena had said when they finally left. At what? Being human. Alexander had looked at her strangely. I'm always human, Elena. Not at work. At work, you're a machine. Efficient. Cold. Calculating. That's because at work, I can't afford to be anything else. He'd paused at the car door. My grandfather taught me that showing weakness in business gets you destroyed. And he was right. I've seen competitors try to use emotion against me, try to manipulate me through sympathy or sentiment. I can't allow that. But you let your guard down tonight, Elena had observed. With my employees. Why? Alexander had been quiet for a long moment. Then, because they matter to you. And somewhere along the way, what matters to you started mattering to me. Third crack. 1 year into the marriage. Elena had been working late in her home office, the spare bedroom she'd converted into a workspace, when Alexander had knocked on the open door. It's past midnight, he'd said. You need to sleep. Can't. This proposal is due tomorrow, and I'm missing something. The numbers don't add up. Alexander had crossed her desk, looking over her shoulder at the spreadsheets. May I? For the next 2 hours, they'd worked together, Alexander's sharp business mind identifying the accounting error that had been throwing off Elena's calculations. They'd fixed the proposal, ordered takeout Chinese food at 2 in the morning, and talked about everything and nothing while they ate. Why did you really choose me? Elena had asked, emboldened by exhaustion and the strange intimacy of the late hour. Alexander had set down his chopsticks. I told you. Your company had value. No. I've met 20 of your competitors now. I've seen how you operate. You could have found a dozen other ways to handle my father's debt. Why did you offer marriage? He'd been quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because when you stood up in that boardroom and offered yourself as collateral for your father's company, I saw courage. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from having nothing to lose, but the kind that comes from having everything to lose and doing it anyway. And I thought that someone with that much courage might be able to understand what it's like to do what's necessary, even when it hurts. You thought I'd understand you, Elena had said softly. I thought you wouldn't judge me for being what I have to be. Elena had reached across the desk and taken his hand. For what it's worth, I think the person you have to be is different from the person you actually are. And the person you actually are is worth knowing. Alexander had looked at their joined hands like he was seeing them for the first time. Then he'd stood abruptly, pulling away. It's late. You should sleep. He'd left before Elena could respond. But the next morning, she'd found a note on her desk. You're right about the numbers, and maybe you're right about other things too. Thank you for the company last night. Fourth crack. 15 months into the marriage. The charity gala where they'd supposedly met, now celebrating its annual occurrence, had required their attendance. Elena had worn a deep green gown that Francesca had insisted brought out her eyes. Alexander had worn his standard tuxedo and his standard expression, coolly pleasant, distant, controlled. They'd mingled with donors, had posed for photos, had played their parts perfectly. Until Richard Sterling had appeared. Alexander's cousin was everything Alexander wasn't. Loud, brash, quick to smile and quicker to judge. He'd had too much to drink, and he'd decided to share his opinions about Alexander's sudden marriage. Come on, Alex, Richard had said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. We all know this is a business arrangement. Poor little Elena probably needed money, and you needed a wife for grandfather's trust. It's brilliant, really. Cold and calculated, just like everything you do. Elena had felt Alexander tense beside her, had seen the muscle in his jaw tick. But before he could respond, she'd stepped forward. You're right, she'd said sweetly, and Richard had looked surprised. It was cold and calculated. I calculated that Alexander Sterling is 10 times the man you'll ever be. And I was cold enough to pursue him despite your family's obvious dysfunction. The business part came later, when I realized that being his wife means helping him keep this company away from people like you who would destroy everything his grandfather built. The crowd around them had gone silent. Richard's face had turned purple. And just for the record, Elena had continued, her voice dropping to something dangerous, Alexander didn't need to buy a wife. I chose him. The same way he chose me. So if you're jealous that your cousin found someone who actually believes in him while you're still drinking alone at charity events, that's your problem. Not ours. She'd taken Alexander's arm and walked away, leaving Richard speechless. Later, in the car ride home, Alexander had been quiet. Elena had worried she'd overstepped, that she'd embarrassed him, that she'd. Thank you, he'd said quietly. For what? For defending me. For. He'd paused, struggling with the words. For saying you chose me, even if it's not entirely true. Elena had looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something that made her chest tight. Alexander, when I signed that contract, I chose security, financial stability, my father's company. But somewhere along the way, I started choosing you. Every day, every conversation, every late-night working session and every charity gala and every moment of this strange life we've built. I keep choosing you. Alexander had pulled the car over, right there on the side of the highway, and turned to face her. Elena. You don't have to say anything, she'd interrupted. I know the contract has 10 more months. I know this is supposed to be temporary. I'm not asking you to change the arrangement. I just wanted you to know that for me, it stopped being an arrangement a long time ago. When? His voice had been barely a whisper. When you held my hand in the hospital. When you stayed at my employee's party. When you helped me with my proposal at 2 in the morning. When you gave me your grandmother's necklace and said you hoped I'd have more joy than tears. Elena had smiled, even though her eyes were wet. You keep showing me who you are beneath the ice, Alexander, and I like that person. More than I should. More than is probably safe. Alexander had stared at her for a long moment. Then he'd reached out and cupped her face in his hand, the first time he'd touched her face since their wedding day. I don't know how to do this, he'd admitted. I don't know how to be what you deserve. I don't need you to be anything other than yourself, the real yourself, not the CEO, not the Ice King, just Alexander. He'd leaned forward and kissed her forehead, tender, gentle, reverent. Give me time. Please. It's terrifying. Take all the time you need, Elena had whispered. I'm not going anywhere. The biggest crack yet. 18 months into the marriage. Alexander's grandfather had been dying. Cancer, aggressive and fast-moving. He'd called Alexander and Elena to his bedside at the Sterling estate. Stop pretending, the old man had rasped, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. You think I don't know a business arrangement when I see one? Elena's heart had dropped. Alexander had gone pale. Grandfather. Quiet, boy.
I'm dying.
I get to talk. The old man had coughed, and Elena had helped him sip water. I know why you married her. For the shares. For the company. I'm not senile. Sir, I can explain. Elena had started. I said quiet. Both of you. He'd fixed them with that sharp gaze. I set up the trust not because I wanted you to get married, Alexander. I set it up because I wanted you to find a reason to let someone in. You've been alone since your parents died. Alone and frozen. Building walls so high that nobody could reach you. Alexander's hands had clenched into fists. You manipulated me. I gave you motivation, his grandfather had corrected. And it worked better than I'd hoped. Because yes, you married her for the shares. But you fell in love with her because of who she is. Don't argue, he'd added when Alexander opened his mouth. I've watched you too. I've seen the way you look at her when she's not watching. The way you smile at something she said 3 hours ago. The way you've softened. I haven't. You have. And it's the best thing that ever happened to you. The old man had turned to Elena. And you, girl, you married him for your father's company. Noble. Stupid, but noble. But you fell in love with him too. I can see it in the way you defend him. The way you stand beside him instead of behind him. The way you've broken through his walls without even trying. Elena had felt tears on her cheeks. Mr. Sterling. Call me grandfather. You've earned it. He'd reached out with shaking hands and taken one of Alexander's hands and one of Elena's, placing them together. You two started with a contract. A business deal. But you've built something real. Something that will last long after I'm gone and long after that stupid trust expires. Don't waste it. Don't let fear or pride or that damn Sterling stubbornness destroy what you found. He died 3 days later, with Alexander and Elena at his bedside. At the funeral, Alexander had held Elena's hand the entire time. And when they'd returned to the penthouse that night, he hadn't gone to his bedroom. He'd followed Elena to hers. "I don't want to be alone tonight," he'd said quietly. "Then don't be." They'd lain in bed together, just lying there, not touching, not speaking. But sometime in the night, Elena had woken to find Alexander's arm around her waist, his face pressed against her shoulder, and the sound of his breathing deep and even. The ice hadn't just cracked. It had begun to melt. 22 months into the marriage. They'd fought. Their first real fight. It was about a business decision. Sterling Industries wanted to acquire a smaller construction company that competed with Martinez Construction. Alexander thought it made financial sense. Elena thought it would destroy a family business and put 200 more people at risk. "This is business," Alexander had said, his voice cooling to that familiar ice. "We can't let sentiment cloud judgment. This isn't sentiment. This is people's lives. Just like my father's company was people's lives. And I saved your father's company. That doesn't mean I have to save every struggling business in the city. No, but it means you should at least consider the human cost before you destroy something that 3 generations built." They'd yelled. Actually yelled. Alexander had retreated into cold formality, and Elena had retreated into hurt silence. They'd slept in separate rooms for the first time in 4 months. The next morning, Elena had woken to find Alexander sitting in the chair beside her bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking exhausted. "I called off the acquisition," he'd said without preamble. "What?" "You're right. I've spent so long protecting myself from emotion that I forgot there's a difference between being ruthless and being cruel. That family deserves a chance to save their company, the same way your father deserved a chance." He'd run a hand through his hair, making it stand up in messy spikes that somehow made him look more human. "I'm trying, Elena. I'm trying to be the person my grandfather thought I could be. The person you see when you look at me. But it's hard. Letting go of control is terrifying," Elena had finished softly. She'd gotten out of bed and crossed to him, kneeling beside the chair. "I know. Trust me, I know. But Alexander, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. With me, and with yourself." "I'm not good at honest," he'd admitted. "I've spent 15 years hiding what I really feel, using ice and distance as armor. I don't know how to take off that armor without feeling exposed." "Then stay exposed with me," Elena had said. "Let me see you. All of you. The good parts and the scared parts and the parts you think are too damaged to show anyone. I'm not going anywhere." Alexander had pulled her up into his lap, holding her so tightly it almost hurt. "I love you," he'd whispered against her hair. "God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me. Because everyone I've ever loved has left. My mother died. My father gave up. My grandfather just. And I can't lose you too. I can't." Elena had felt tears streaming down her face. "You won't lose me. I'm not going anywhere. I love you, Alexander Sterling. Not the CEO. Not the Ice King. Not the heir to a fortune. You. The man who carried me to bed when I fell asleep in the car. The man who held my hand in a hospital. The man who plays basketball with children and listens to old employee stories and works on spreadsheets at 2 in the morning because it matters to me. That's who I love." They'd kissed then, properly kissed, for the first time since their wedding day. And it had felt like coming home. Which brings us back to today. 2 years. The contract complete. "I fell in love with you too," Alexander said now, his hands cupping Elena's face as they stood in the bedroom, their bedroom, watching the sunrise. Slowly, then all at once. It started with respect, became admiration, turned into need, and somehow became this terrifying, wonderful thing that I can't imagine living without. Elena smiled through her tears. "So what do we do now? The contract says we can divorce. That I get my $5 million and full ownership of my father's company. That we are free to walk away." "I have a counter-proposal," Alexander said. His hands were shaking slightly, and Elena realized that the great Alexander Sterling was nervous. "What if instead of ending our marriage, we start it? Really start it? Not as a business arrangement, but as partners. As people who chose each other not because we had to, but because we want to. You mean? I mean I want to renew our vows. In front of everyone who matters, with honest words and real promises. I want to go on dates and argue about what to watch on TV and plan a future that doesn't have an expiration date. I want to build a life with you, Elena. A real life. If you'll have me. Elena laughed, the sound somewhere between a sob and joy. On one condition. Alexander's eyes widened slightly. Anything. I keep Martina's construction. Not because you gave it to me, but because I earned it. I'm not just Mrs. Sterling. I'm Elena Martina Sterling. CEO. Partner. Your equal. You've always been my equal, Alexander said softly. That's why I married you in the first place. I just wasn't ready to admit it. And the $5 million. Keep it. Invest it. Donate it. I don't care. I never should have offered you money for something as important as your time, your trust, your presence in my life. You're worth more than any contract could ever capture. Elena kissed him then, pouring 2 years of growing love into it, all the moments that had brought them here, all the cracks in the ice that had finally let the warmth through. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Alexander pressed his forehead to hers. So is that a yes? That's a yes, Elena confirmed. To renewing our vows. To really starting our marriage. To building a life together. All of it. Yes. 6 months later. The garden at Sterling Estate looked almost exactly as it had on their first wedding day. Autumn colors, white roses, elegant guests. But everything else was different. Elena's father walked her down the aisle again, but this time he was smiling through tears of joy instead of guilt. This time, Elena wore a dress she'd chosen herself, simpler than the first, more her style. This time, when she reached the altar, Alexander was already crying. I wrote my own vows this time, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The first time, I spoke traditional words that I didn't really understand. I said I'd love you until death parted us, but I didn't know what love was. I thought love was weakness. I thought it was dangerous. He took her hands, holding them like they were the most precious thing in the world. I was right that it's dangerous. But it's dangerous the way flying is dangerous. Yes, you could fall, but the view from up there is so beautiful that the risk is worth it. You taught me that, Elena. You taught me that ice might protect you from pain, but it also keeps you from joy, from warmth, from life. Elena's tears were falling freely now. So here are my real vows, Alexander continued. I vow to keep letting you in, even when it's scary. I vow to fight fair and apologize when I'm wrong. I vow to be your partner in every sense, in business, in life, in all the small moments that make up a marriage. I vow to keep learning how to be better, how to be softer, how to be brave enough to stay vulnerable with you. And I vow to love you, not because a contract says I should, not because it's practical, but because loving you is the most honest thing I've ever done. Elena's voice shook as she spoke her own vows. 2 years ago, I stood here and promised to be your wife. I meant those promises, even though I didn't fully understand what they would cost me. What I didn't expect was what they would give me. You gave me frustration and challenge and moments where I wanted to shake you. But you also gave me patience and strength and a love I never thought possible. She squeezed his hands. I vow to keep surprising you, keep challenging you, keep being honest with you even when it's uncomfortable. I vow to be your partner and your equal, to build my own life while sharing it with you. I vow to give you space when you need it and to hold on tight when you need that instead. And I vow to love you, the cold CEO and the warm man underneath, the genius businessman and the person who still doesn't know how to work our coffee maker. All of you. For the rest of my life. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, again, Alexander kissed Elena like a man who'd been lost in winter and had finally found spring. The reception was joyful in a way their first wedding hadn't been. Real laughter, real dancing, real celebration. Alexander danced with Elena's father and thanked him for raising such a strong daughter. Elena danced with Victoria and thanked her for her patience and kindness during those first confusing months. Maria from Martina's construction caught the bouquet. Jose's grandson declared that Alexander was actually pretty cool for a rich guy. Yuki gave a toast about how love built on respect lasted longer than love built on passion alone. As the sun set and guests began to drift away, Alexander pulled Elena into a quiet corner of the garden. "Ready to go to the Rose Cottage?" he asked with a slight smile. "Ready," Elena confirmed. "But this time, neither of us is sleeping on the couch." "Agreed." They walked hand in hand through the twilight, toward the cottage that had witnessed their first night as a married couple, a night of awkwardness and distance and sleeping separately, a night that had been the beginning of a journey neither of them had expected. Inside the cottage, nothing had changed physically. Same four-poster bed, same cozy sitting room, same fireplace. But everything had changed between them. "I was so scared that night," Alexander admitted, pulling Elena close. "Scared that you'd expect something I couldn't give. Scared that you'd see through me and realize I was just a damaged man playing at being strong." "I was scared too," Elena said. "Scared that I'd made a terrible mistake. Scared that I'd lose myself in this arrangement. Scared that I'd fall in love with someone who could never love me back. But you did it anyway." "But I did it anyway," Elena confirmed. "And you know what? The scary thing wasn't falling in love with you. The scary thing was realizing that you were falling in love with me too, and watching you fight it every step of the way." Alexander laughed softly. "I did fight it, didn't I? So much energy wasted trying to keep the ice from melting. Was it worth it?" Elena asked. "The melting?" Instead of answering with words, Alexander showed her. He kissed her with all the warmth that had been frozen inside him for so many years, with all the love he'd been too afraid to express, with all the tenderness he'd thought he'd lost when his parents died. And Elena kissed him back, pouring her own love into it, the love that had grown from frustration to respect to friendship to this overwhelming thing that filled her entire chest. Later, lying together in the bed they'd been too scared to share 2 years ago, Alexander traced idle patterns on Elena's arm. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "That night in my office, when Victoria mentioned the wedding night arrangements and I got so cold and formal, you didn't know me yet, but you already stood up to me. Why?" Elena thought about it. "Because underneath all that ice, I saw something familiar. I saw someone who was protecting themselves the only way they knew how. And I guess I recognized that because I do the same thing, I use determination and stubbornness and work as my armor. You used distance and control. Different weapons, same war." "What war?" "The war against being hurt," Elena said softly. "Against being vulnerable. Against needing someone else." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "I think I've been fighting that war since I was 16. Since I watched my mother die and my father give up. I thought if I never needed anyone, never let anyone in, I'd never have to feel that kind of pain again. And now I realize that protecting yourself from pain also protects you from everything else. From joy, from connection, from love." He turned to face her fully. "You know what the scariest part of loving you is?" "What?" "Knowing that if I lost you, it would break me. Completely. The way losing my parents broke my father. And I spent 15 years building walls to make sure I'd never be that vulnerable again. But here I am, totally exposed, and I can't even regret it because being with you is worth the risk." Elena felt tears prick her eyes again. "You're not going to lose me, Alexander. We are partners now. Real partners. That means when things get hard, and they will get hard, we face it together. You don't have to protect yourself from me. You don't have to be perfect or strong or controlled all the time. You can just be." "I'm still learning how to do that," Alexander admitted. "Then we'll learn together." Elena snuggled closer to him. "We've got time. All the time in the world. No contract. No expiration date. Just us." "Just us," Alexander repeated, and Elena could hear the smile in his voice. "I like the sound of that." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, two people who had started as strangers, become reluctant business partners, and somehow found their way to love. 5 years later, Elena sat in the hospital room, her hand gripped tightly by Alexander's. He looked terrified, more scared than she'd ever seen him, even more scared than that first wedding day when he'd been asking a stranger to be his wife. "You're doing great," the doctor encouraged. "Just one more push." Elena pushed, squeezing Alexander's hand so hard she was probably cutting off circulation. He didn't complain. He just held on, his other hand stroking her hair back from her sweaty forehead, murmuring encouragement. And then, a cry. A beautiful, loud, healthy cry. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, holding up a tiny, perfect baby girl. Alexander's face transformed. All the ice, all the careful control he still sometimes retreated into when the world got too overwhelming, it melted completely. Tears streamed down his face as the nurse placed their daughter in Elena's arms. "Oh my God," Elena breathed, looking down at the tiny face, the perfect tiny fingers. "Alexander, look at her." "She's perfect," Alexander whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "She's absolutely perfect. Just like her mother." The baby had Alexander's dark hair and Elena's nose. She was absolutely perfect. "What should we name her?" Elena asked. They debated names for months, never quite settling on one. But now, looking at this perfect little person they'd created, Alexander said, "What about Hope? Hope Sterling." Elena looked at him with surprise and love. "Hope?" "Because that's what you gave me," Alexander said softly, touching his daughter's tiny hand with one finger. "Hope that I could be better. Hope that I could love and be loved. Hope for a future I didn't think I deserved." "Hope it is," Elena agreed, tears streaming down her face. "Hope Elena Sterling." Later, after the visitors had left and Elena was sleeping, Alexander sat in the chair beside her bed with Hope in his arms. The tiny baby was sleeping too, completely peaceful, trusting. "I'm going to mess this up sometimes," Alexander told his sleeping daughter. "I'm not good at emotions, and I still retreat into ice when I'm scared. Your mother is teaching me to be better, but it's a work in progress. But I promise you this, I will never be so afraid of being hurt that I make you feel unloved. I will never be so controlled that you don't feel safe being yourself. And I will never, ever let you think that being vulnerable is the same as being weak." He pressed a gentle kiss to Hope's forehead. "Your grandmother, my mother, would have loved you so much. And your great-grandfather, he'd be so proud. He's the one who started all of this, you know. He manipulated me into meeting your mother. Best manipulation of my life." Hope made a small sound in her sleep, and Alexander's heart squeezed with overwhelming love. "I thought I knew what love was when I married your mother," he continued softly. "But this is different. You've been alive for 3 hours, and I would already burn down the world to keep you safe. Is this how my father felt about me? Is this what he lost when my mother died?" For the first time in 15 years, Alexander thought about his father with compassion instead of resentment. His father had loved his mother so completely that losing her had broken him. Alexander had spent years thinking his father was weak for giving up. But now, holding his own daughter, he understood. Not the giving up part. He'd never do that to Hope or Elena, but the loving so much that the possibility of loss was terrifying. The door opened quietly, and Elena stirred awake. She smiled when she saw Alexander holding Hope. "You look good with a baby," she murmured sleepily. "I look terrified," Alexander corrected, but he was smiling. "That too." Elena held out her arms, and Alexander carefully transferred Hope to her. "She's perfect, isn't she?" "She is. You both are." Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm around both of them. "Thank you, Elena, for everything. For taking a chance on a cold-hearted billionaire who didn't know how to love. For teaching me that ice melts in the warmth. For giving me this family I didn't think I deserved." "You deserve all of it," Elena said firmly. "You always did. You just needed someone to remind you." They sat together, mother, father, and daughter, watching the sunrise through the hospital window. The same sunrise that had witnessed so many moments in their journey, the morning after their first wedding, when they'd been strangers bound by contract. The morning of the renewal of their vows, when they'd been partners bound by love. And now this morning, the first of their daughter's life, the beginning of their next chapter. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked quietly. "Signing that contract? Starting all of this?" Alexander looked at his wife, this incredible woman who had seen past his eyes to the person underneath, who had challenged him and loved him and transformed his life, and then at his daughter, this perfect tiny person who represented hope and future and love. Not for a single second, he said honestly. That contract was the best business decision I ever made. Because it brought me you. And you brought me back to life. Elena smiled, but there was something mischievous in her eyes. Speaking of that contract, I have a confession to make. Alexander raised an eyebrow. A confession? Now? I kept it, Elena admitted. The original contract. It's in a safety deposit box at the bank. Why would you keep it? Because someday, when Hope is old enough to understand, I want to show it to her. I want her to know that sometimes the best things in life start in the most unexpected ways. That love doesn't always look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like a desperate woman and a cold-hearted CEO making a business deal that turned into something neither of them expected. Alexander laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby. You want to tell our daughter that her parents' marriage started as a transaction. I want to tell our daughter that her parents started as two people protecting themselves from pain, who found each other at exactly the right moment, who fought like hell against falling in love, and who built something real out of something fake. That's a better love story than love at first sight. Because we chose each other. Again and again. Every single day. You make it sound romantic. It is romantic, Elena insisted. You gave me your grandmother's ring before you even liked me. You held my hand in a hospital when we were still practically strangers. You carried me to bed when I fell asleep in the car. You changed business decisions because I asked you to consider the human cost. You learned to be vulnerable even though it terrified you. That's the most romantic thing in the world, choosing love even when everything in your past told you not to. Alexander leaned over and kissed her forehead, then Hope's. When you put it that way, I suppose we do have quite a story to tell. The best story, Elena confirmed. And it's still being written. 3 years later. Hope was 3 years old, all dark curls and bright curiosity, asking approximately 1 million questions per day. She had her father's intensity and her mother's stubbornness, which made for an exhausting but delightful combination. It was Sunday morning, and the Sterling Martinez family had a tradition, pancakes in the penthouse kitchen, made by whoever drew the short straw. This week, Alexander had lost. Daddy, why is the smoke alarm singing? Hope asked from her perch on the kitchen counter, where Elena was supervising her supervision of Alexander's cooking. Because your father is burning the pancakes again, Elena said, trying not to laugh as Alexander frantically waved a dish towel at the smoke detector. I'm not burning them, I'm caramelizing them, Alexander protested. Caramelizing, Hope repeated carefully, as if learning a new scientific term. That means Bernie, right, Mama? That means Bernie, Elena confirmed, finally taking pity on Alexander and rescuing the pan. Okay, new plan. I'll cook, you set the table, and Hope can be quality control. What's quality control? Hope asked immediately. She is. You both are. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm around both of them. Thank you, Elena, for everything. For taking a chance on a cold-hearted billionaire who didn't know how to love. For teaching me that ice melts in the warmth. For giving me this family I didn't think I deserved. You deserve all of it, Elena said firmly. You always did. You just needed someone to remind you. They sat together, mother, father, and daughter, watching the sunrise through the hospital window. The same sunrise that had witnessed so many moments in their journey, the morning after their first wedding, when they'd been strangers bound by contract. The morning of the renewal of their vows, when they'd been partners bound by love. And now this morning, the first of their daughter's life, the beginning of their next chapter. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked quietly. Signing that contract? Starting all of this? Alexander looked at his wife, this incredible woman who had seen past his eyes to the person underneath, who had challenged him and loved him and transformed his life, and then at his daughter, this perfect tiny person who represented hope and future and love. Not for a single second, he said honestly. That contract was the best business decision I ever made. Because it brought me you. And you brought me back to life. Elena smiled, but there was something mischievous in her eyes. Speaking of that contract, I have a confession to make. Alexander raised an eyebrow. A confession? Now. I kept it, Elena admitted. The original contract. It's in a safety deposit box at the bank. Why would you keep it? Because someday, when Hope is old enough to understand, I want to show it to her. I want her to know that sometimes the best things in life start in the most unexpected ways. That love doesn't always look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like a desperate woman and a cold-hearted CEO making a business deal that turned into something neither of them expected. Alexander laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby. You want to tell our daughter that her parents' marriage started as a transaction. I want to tell our daughter that her parents started as two people protecting themselves from pain, who found each other at exactly the right moment, who fought like hell against falling in love, and who built something real out of something fake. That's a better love story than love at first sight. Because we chose each other. Again and again. Every single day. You make it sound romantic. It is romantic, Elena insisted. You gave me your grandmother's ring before you even liked me. You held my hand in a hospital when we were still practically strangers. You carried me to bed when I fell asleep in the car. You changed business decisions because I asked you to consider the human cost. You learned to be vulnerable even though it terrified you. That's the most romantic thing in the world, choosing love even when everything in your past told you not to. Alexander leaned over and kissed her forehead, then Hope's. When you put it that way, I suppose we do have quite a story to tell. The best story, Elena confirmed. And it's still being written. 3 years later. Hope was 3 years old, all dark curls and bright curiosity, asking approximately 1 million questions per day. She had her father's intensity and her mother's stubbornness, which made for an exhausting but delightful combination. It was Sunday morning, and the Sterling Martinez family had a tradition: pancakes in the penthouse kitchen, made by whoever drew the short straw. This week, Alexander had lost. Daddy, why is the smoke alarm singing? Hope asked from her perch on the kitchen counter, where Elena was supervising her supervision of Alexander's cooking. Because your father is burning the pancakes again, Elena said, trying not to laugh as Alexander frantically waved a dish towel at the smoke detector. I'm not burning them, I'm caramelizing them, Alexander protested. Caramelizing, Hope repeated carefully, as if learning a new scientific term. That means Bernie, right, Mama? That means Bernie, Elena confirmed, finally taking pity on Alexander and rescuing the pan. Okay, new plan. I'll cook, you set the table, and Hope can be quality control. What's quality control? Hope asked immediately. It means you get to taste everything and tell us if it's good, Alexander explained, lifting her down from the counter. I'm very good at tasting. Hope announced proudly. As Elena cooked properly non-burnt pancakes and Alexander set the table with help from their daughter, he caught himself smiling. This, domestic chaos, smoke alarms, a 3-year-old covered in flour, this was what happiness looked like. So different from the sterile, controlled life he'd lived before Elena. After breakfast, while Hope was absorbed in building a tower with her blocks in the living room, Elena and Alexander sat at the kitchen table with their coffee. Victoria called, Elena said. She wanted to remind you about the Sterling Industries board meeting tomorrow. Alexander groaned. I hate board meetings. You own the company. You kind of have to attend. I know. He took a sip of coffee. Richard is going to propose another aggressive acquisition strategy. He always does. And I'll have to explain again why we are focused on sustainable growth instead of rapid expansion. Your grandfather would be proud of the direction you've taken the company, Elena said softly. Building partnerships instead of crushing competitors. Investing in communities. Treating employees like people instead of resources. My grandfather would say I've gone soft, Alexander countered, but he was smiling. And he'd be right. You softened me. You were never as hard as you pretended to be. Before Alexander could respond, Hope appeared at his elbow, dragging her favorite stuffed rabbit. Daddy, Mr. Hoppy wants to know why you're so big and I'm so small. Alexander pulled his daughter into his lap. Well, I used to be small like you, but I grew bigger over time. Will I grow as big as you? Probably not quite as big, but yes, you'll grow. Hope considered this seriously. When I grow big, will I be cold like you? Alexander and Elena exchanged startled looks. Cold? What do you mean, sweetheart? Gamma says you used to be cold. Like ice. Before you met Mama. Alexander looked over Hope's head at Elena, who shrugged with a smile. His father-in-law must have been telling stories again. Your Gamma is right, Alexander said carefully. I was cold once. I had ice around my heart. I thought it protected me. From what? From pain. From loss. From being broken like my father was broken. But Alexander couldn't say that to a 3-year-old. From being hurt, he simplified. But then I met your mama, and the ice started to melt. And when you were born, it melted completely. Now I'm not cold at all. Now I'm warm, because I have you and Mama to keep my heart warm. Hope seemed satisfied with this answer. She snuggled against his chest, and Alexander breathed in the scent of her baby shampoo and syrup from breakfast. Daddy. Hope's voice was getting sleepy. Nap time was approaching. Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you're not cold anymore. Cold is not nice for hugging. Alexander felt his eyes sting with unexpected tears. Over Hope's head, he met Elena's gaze, saw the love and understanding there. I'm glad I'm not cold anymore too, he whispered. 6 years later. Hope was 9 now, and she had a little brother, James Alexander Sterling, 6 years old and absolutely fearless. Where Hope was thoughtful and curious, James was all action and adventure. They balanced each other perfectly, the same way their parents did. It was the week of Hope's school career day, and she'd asked Alexander to come speak to her class. He'd tried to decline. Talking to a room full of 9-year-olds about business seemed like a terrible idea, but Hope had looked at him with those eyes that were so like Elena's, and he'd caved immediately. Now he stood in front of Mrs. Peterson's 4th grade class, feeling more nervous than he'd been before any board meeting or shareholder presentation. My daddy runs a very big company, Hope was telling her classmates proudly. It's called Sterling Industries, and they build buildings and make technology and help communities. That sounds boring, a boy in the back said. Hope's eyes flashed, definitely her mother's daughter. It's not boring. My daddy helps people. He makes sure buildings are safe and that workers are treated fairly and that companies don't hurt the environment. That's important. Alexander felt his chest tighten with pride and love. Why don't you tell us how you met your wife? Mrs. Peterson suggested, trying to redirect the conversation. The children love a good love story. Alexander hesitated. Hope was watching him with bright, curious eyes. They'd never told her the full truth about how their marriage started. She knew the cover story, the charity gala, the whirlwind romance. But she didn't know about the contract, the debt, the business arrangement. Well, Alexander began slowly, I met Hope's mother at a time when we both needed something from each other. I needed. How did he explain this? I needed someone brave enough to take a chance on me, even though I wasn't very good at showing feelings. And she needed someone who would believe in her and support her dreams. Did you love her right away? A little girl asked. Alexander smiled. No, I didn't. In fact, I thought love was something that made you weak. I thought it was safer to keep everyone at a distance, to never let anyone get too close. That's sad, the girl said. It was sad, Alexander agreed. I was very sad, even though I didn't realize it. But then your classmate's mother, my wife, she saw past all my walls and my coldness. She didn't give up on me, even when I gave her lots of reasons to. She taught me that love doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. Because when you love someone, you have something worth fighting for. Did you get married fast? Another student asked. Very fast, Alexander admitted. Maybe too fast, some people thought. But sometimes you just know that someone is going to change your life, and you have to be brave enough to let them. My dad says business people don't have time for love, a boy commented. Alexander thought about all those years of putting business first, of thinking that success and money and power were more important than connection and feeling and love. Your dad might be right about some business people, Alexander said. I used to be one of them. I worked all the time. I never took vacations. I thought making money was the most important thing. But you know what I learned. The most important business decision I ever made wasn't about money or companies or deals. It was choosing to let love into my life. Because what's the point of building an empire if you have no one to share it with? The children were quiet, absorbing this. Then Hope raised her hand. Daddy, tell them about the wedding night story. Alexander froze. The wedding night story. The one Mama tells me sometimes. About how you gave up the comfy bed and slept on a hard couch because you wanted to make sure she felt safe and respected, even though you barely knew each other. Oh, that story. That's true, Alexander said softly. On our wedding night, there was only one bed. And I barely knew your mother, and I wanted her to know that I respected her. So I slept on the couch. It was uncomfortable and my back hurt the next day, but it was the right thing to do. That's romantic, several girls chorused. My mama says romance is about respect, Hope added. She says you showed her respect before you showed her love, and that's why she trusted you. Alexander looked at his daughter, this wise, wonderful little person he and Elena had created, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. For Elena, who had taught him how to love. For Hope and James, who gave him reasons to keep being better. For this life he never thought he deserved. After the presentation, as Alexander was leaving, Hope ran up and hugged him tightly. I'm proud of you, Daddy, she whispered. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. You're brave and kind and smart, just like your mother. And I'm warm, Hope added. Not cold. Because you taught me that it's okay to love people. Alexander knelt down to her level. Where did you hear that? From Mama. She says you were so scared of love that you almost missed out on everything good. But you were brave enough to try, and that's the most important thing. Being brave enough to try. Out of the mouths of babes, Alexander thought. His 9-year-old daughter had just summed up the entire journey of his life. 10 years after the wedding, 8 years after renewal. It was their 10th anniversary, or their 8th, depending on how you counted. They decided to celebrate both, the anniversary of the contract marriage and the anniversary of the renewal of vows. Because both were important. Both were part of their story. Elena and Alexander had left the kids with her father for the weekend and returned to Sterling Estate, to the Rose Cottage where they'd spent both wedding nights. I can't believe it's been 10 years since I walked into your boardroom, Elena said, standing at the same window where she'd stood on their wedding night, looking out at the grounds. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. 10 years since you offered yourself as collateral for your father's debt. 10 years since you proposed the most insane business arrangement in history. Best insane business arrangement in history, Alexander corrected. It gave me you, and Hope, and James, and this life I never imagined I could have. Elena turned in his arms. At 36, she was even more beautiful than she'd been at 26. Confidence and happiness had added depth to her features, laugh lines around her eyes from a decade of joy. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had said no? She asked. All the time, Alexander admitted. I think about what my life would be like if you'd walked out of that boardroom and found another way to save your father's company. I'd probably have married someone else, some society woman who wanted my money and my name. Or I'd have lost the company to Richard and become a bitter, lonely man living off my trust fund. Either way, I'd be miserable. I think about it too, Elena confessed. I think about what would have happened if you'd been as cold in private as you were in public. If you'd treated me like an employee instead of a person. If you'd never let me in. Why didn't you leave? Alexander asked. Those first few months, I was so cold to you. I barely spoke to you at home. I avoided you whenever possible. I treated you like a business obligation. Why did you stay? Elena thought about it. I saw cracks. Little moments where the ice would slip and I'd see the real you underneath. The way you held my hand in the hospital. The way you'd leave coffee for me in the morning, made exactly how I like it, even though you pretended not to notice my preferences. The way you'd ask about my day and actually listen to the answer, even when you were exhausted. Those little moments gave me hope that there was more to you than the cold exterior. There almost wasn't, Alexander said quietly. I was so good at being cold. So practiced at it. If you'd been anyone else, if you'd accepted the ice and never pushed for more, I probably would have stayed frozen forever. But I didn't accept it. And you didn't stay frozen. No, Alexander agreed. I didn't. Because you were worth the risk of melting. They were quiet for a moment, holding each other, reflecting on the decade that had passed. I have something for you, Elena said finally. She pulled an envelope from her purse. Your anniversary present. Alexander opened it curiously. Inside was a legal document. He scanned it quickly, then looked at Elena in surprise. You're dissolving the contract? He asked. I'm officially destroying it, Elena corrected. It's been sitting in that safety deposit box for 8 years, since we renewed our vows. And I realized I don't need it anymore. I don't need proof of where we started, because where we are now is proof enough. So I had my lawyer draw up dissolution papers. The contract is void. It never existed, legally speaking. Alexander stared at the papers, feeling emotion well up in his chest. But you said you wanted to keep it, to show Hope someday. I have something better to show her. Elena pulled out a small leather journal. I've been keeping a journal since the day I signed the contract. Everything we've been through, every moment that mattered, every fight and every reconciliation. The real story, not the sanitized version. When she's old enough, I'll give her this. So she knows that real love isn't perfect or easy, but it's always worth fighting for. Alexander took the journal with shaking hands. Can I read it? Someday. But not today. Today is about celebrating where we are, not analyzing how we got here. Where we are, Alexander repeated. And where is that, exactly? Elena smiled. We are standing in a cottage where we spent our first night as a married couple. Two scared people who didn't know each other and didn't know how to love. And now we are two people who know each other completely, who love each other deeply, who've built a family and a life and a partnership that's stronger than any contract could ever be. That's where we are. Alexander set down the journal and the legal papers and pulled Elena close. I love you, he said simply. Not because I have to. Not because it's practical or beneficial or strategic. I love you because you're you. Because you saw past my ice. Because you didn't give up. Because every day with you is better than any day before you. I love you too, Elena whispered. The cold-hearted billionaire who wasn't cold at all. The man who carried me to bed and held my hand in hospitals and learned to be vulnerable. The father who plays tea party with his daughter and builds forts with his son. All of you. Every version. For the rest of my life. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of a decade of love. 15 years later. Hope was 18, about to start college. James was 15, already showing signs of being as brilliant in business as his father. And Elena and Alexander sat in the kitchen of their Connecticut house. They'd moved out of the penthouse 5 years ago, wanting more space and a yard for the kids, preparing for Hope's graduation party. Mom, have you seen my, oh? Hope stopped in the doorway, her face breaking into a grin. You two are being gross and romantic again. We are just hugging, Elena protested, but she didn't move out of Alexander's arms. You're always just hugging, or just holding hands, or just looking at each other like saps. But Hope was smiling. It's actually kind of cute. Annoying, but cute. Wait until you fall in love, Alexander told his daughter. Then you'll understand. I'm never falling in love, Hope declared. I'm going to focus on my career. Love is a distraction. Alexander and Elena exchanged amused looks. That's what I said once, Alexander admitted. I was very wrong. Besides, Elena added, you can have both, a career and love. I have Martina's construction, your father has Sterling Industries, and we have each other and you kids. It's not either or. Hope rolled her eyes, but she was still smiling. Fine. But if I do fall in love, it's going to be nothing like your weird contract marriage situation. I'm going to meet someone normal, in a normal way, and have a normal relationship. Our relationship is normal, Alexander protested. Dad, you literally paid Mom $5 million to marry you. I didn't pay her to. It was more complicated then. Alexander looked helplessly at Elena. He's right. It was more complicated, Elena said, trying not to laugh. The $5 million was contractual obligated, but I never actually took the money. It's still sitting in an account that we use for charity. Hope's eyes widened. Wait, You never took the money? I thought that was the whole point of the arrangement. The point was saving my father's company, Elena corrected. The money was just extra. And by the time I could have taken it, I didn't want it anymore. I wanted your father. The money didn't matter. That's... Hope seemed to struggle for words. That's actually really romantic, Mom. In a weird, complicated way. Love is often weird and complicated, Alexander said. That's what makes it worth it. James appeared then, carrying a basketball. Are we having another family feelings moment? Because I was going to go shoot hoops. Yes, we are having a feelings moment, Hope told her brother. Apparently Mom never took the $5 million from Dad's weird marriage contract because she fell in love with him. Yeah, I know, James said with a shrug. Dad told me that story years ago. He said the best investment he ever made was giving up control and letting someone love him. Very sappy. Can I go shoot hoops now? Both kids left, and Elena and Alexander looked at each other. They think we are sappy, Elena observed. We are sappy, Alexander agreed. Incredibly sappy. When did that happen? Around year 3, I think. When you started writing me love notes and leaving them around the house. You started that tradition, Alexander protested, with your sticky notes on my briefcase. You put a love letter in my lunchbox when I had that big presentation. You dedicated your industry award speech to me. They were both laughing now, remembering 15 years of accumulated sappiness. We've come a long way from separate bedrooms and cold formality, Elena said. We have, Alexander agreed. Sometimes I still can't believe you took a chance on me, that you signed that contract. Sometimes I can't believe you asked me to. Elena cupped his face in her hands. But I'm glad you did. I'm glad for all of it, the contract, the cold wedding night, the slow thaw, the moment you finally admitted you loved me, all of it. Because it brought us here. Where's here? Here is 15 years of marriage, 2 amazing kids, successful careers, a life full of love and laughter and the occasional argument about who forgot to buy milk. Here is everything I never knew I wanted. Alexander kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Here is perfect, he agreed. 20 years later. Alexander Sterling was 53 years old, and he was dying. Not immediately. The doctor said he had 2 years, maybe 3 with treatment. A rare degenerative disease, the same one that had killed his mother, finally manifesting in him after all these years. He'd known it was a possibility. The genetic testing had shown a 50% chance. He'd just always assumed he'd be in the lucky 50%. He wasn't. Elena took the news the way she took everything, with strength and determination and a refusal to give up. She researched treatments, found the best specialists, reorganized their lives around fighting this disease. We'll beat this, she said fiercely, holding his hand in the oncologist's office. We've beaten everything else. But Alexander knew. He'd watched his mother die of this. There was no beating it. There was only prolonging, and eventually, surrendering. Elena, he said gently, we need to talk about what happens.
No.
Her voice was sharp. We are not having that conversation. You're not giving up. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic. Realistic is finding every possible treatment and fighting like hell. Realistic is not planning your funeral when we still have years together. Alexander pulled her into his arms, feeling her shake with suppressed tears. His strong, fierce Elena, who had fought for him from the very beginning, who had broken through his ice and taught him how to love, who had given him 2 decades of happiness he never thought possible. Okay, he whispered into her hair. We'll fight. But Elena, promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when the time comes, and it will come, love, you'll let me go. You'll say goodbye. And then you'll live. Really live. Not like my father did, just existing without my mother. Promise me you'll be happy again. Elena pulled back, tears streaming down her face. How can I promise that? How can I be happy without you? The same way I was happy with you when I thought I could never be happy again. You taught me that, Elena. You taught me that it's possible to heal, to open up, to love again. If I taught you anything in 20 years, I hope I taught you the same lesson. They fought. They tried every treatment, every experimental drug, every alternative therapy. Alexander continued running Sterling Industries with Hope as his second-in-command. She joined the company after business school, brilliant and fierce like her mother. James was in medical school, driven by his father's diagnosis to help others. They had good days and bad days. Days when Alexander felt almost normal, and days when he could barely get out of bed. Through it all, Elena was there, holding his hand, making him laugh, reminding him of their story. On their 22nd anniversary, Alexander was in the hospital. Elena came with a small cake and 2 forks, dismissing the nurses so they could have privacy. 22 years, she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. 22 years since I walked into your boardroom. 20 years since we renewed our vows, Alexander added. His voice was weaker now, his body failing. Best 20 years of my life. Mine too. Elena fed him a bite of cake. Do you remember what you said to me that first wedding night? When I asked why you were taking the couch? I said that just because our marriage was a business arrangement didn't mean I had to be cruel about it. You've never been cruel, Elena said softly. Not once in 22 years. Even when you were at your coldest, even when you were protecting yourself, you were never cruel. You've been kind and generous and patient and loving. You gave me everything. I gave you a contract and a cold wedding night, Alexander said with a weak smile. You gave me yourself, Elena corrected. Slowly, piece by piece, you let me see the real Alexander Sterling, the man behind the ice. And that was the greatest gift I've ever received. Alexander took her hand, lacing their fingers together. The same hands that had signed a contract 22 years ago. The same hands that had held each other through joy and sorrow, through raising children and building businesses, through laughter and tears and everything in between. I'm not afraid, he said quietly. I thought I would be. I've been afraid of losing people my whole life. But I'm not afraid of this. Because I had you. I had our children. I had 2 decades of love that I never thought possible. How can I be afraid when I've had all that? Elena's tears fell onto their joined hands. I am afraid. I am terrified. I don't know how to do this without you. Yes, you do, Alexander said firmly. You're the strongest person I've ever known. You'll grieve. I want you to grieve. But then you'll live. You'll run Martina's construction. You'll be there for Hope and James. You'll laugh and love and find joy again. Promise me. I promise, Elena whispered. But only because you asked. Alexander Sterling died on a Tuesday morning, with Elena holding one hand and Hope holding the other, with James standing at the foot of the bed, with autumn sunlight streaming through the window. His last words were, "Thank you for melting the ice." 5 years after Alexander's death, Elena stood in the Sterling Industries boardroom, the same boardroom where this story had begun 27 years ago. But so much had changed. She was 56 now, silver threading through her dark hair. Hope was 33, CEO of Sterling Industries after working her way up just like Elena had worked her way up through Martina's construction. James was 30, a successful oncologist researching the disease that had killed his father. They were gathered for a special board meeting. Hope had called it, said it was important. I've been doing some reorganizing, Hope explained to the board. Going through old files, old contracts, old business arrangements. And I found something interesting. She pulled out a folder, old, yellowed with age, and set it on the table. Elena's heart stopped. She recognized that folder. This is the original contract between Alexander Sterling and Elena Martinez, Hope continued. The marriage agreement that started everything. I know the basics of the story, how Grandpa's debt brought them together, how Dad needed a wife for the inheritance, how they turned a business arrangement into real love. But I never saw the actual contract until now. She opened the folder, and Elena held her breath. And here's what's interesting, Hope said. There's a clause on page 47 that I don't think either of them ever enacted. A clause that says if the marriage resulted in children, Martina's construction would be held in trust for those children, to be inherited equally regardless of gender, with the stipulation that they must prove themselves worthy through work and dedication before the inheritance will be handed over to. Thanks for taking your precious time watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for continuation of the story.